Here's my showcase on Poland, covering everything that I've shown in class for the past 9 weeks, including some other bonus stuff that I found this week. So first, we have the origins of Poland. So the word Poland comes from the word Polane, which was a West Slavic tribe, where the name means people of the fields. It started appearing with the formation of Poland as described by written sources in the 10th century. In the initial formation, Poland had the Piast dynasty as a force that united various tribes and towns and groups starting earlier, and then the unification of all those tribes and areas started in the year 1000 officially, and this wasn't completed until the late 13th century due to the need for conquest and a bit of exploration and treaties and such. The initial history of Poland was that the Piast dynasty was uniting it under Christianity, or rather Catholic Christianity. So there were a variety of pagan uprisings because they didn't want to give up their religion, and some political fumbles which involved the king splitting the nation among all of his sons, and then they had to reunify the 6 sections of Poland into a country. But due to all of that, Poland ended up having a decently strong nation and persisted until several hundred years later. As with all countries, the many aspects are influenced by the geography and location of the nation. Being a Central European country, Poland has a largely uniform land mass, which is great for a lot of crop growth and forestry. So it blends the kind of more forest climate of Germany with the drier, flatter climate of countries like Slovakia, because it's located between the two. And along with the various types of weather patterns and geology, the people mixed too, taking their culture with them and integrating it into society. But returning to geography, Poland lacks extreme terrain, as it's generally largely a massive valley area, as the bulk of Poland is located about 200 meters below sea level for the entirety of it. As it was actually formed by melting glaciers eroding the land, which leaves a lot of rich earth, but it also leaves a lot of sandy earth, which is currently has a lot of forests grown into it. This type of ground is known as podzol because this type of ground is known as podzol, which is found in the forestry areas. The coniferous forests grow in this area because they're pretty much one of the only things that can reliably make it in there, as opposed to crops. The forests often are made exclusively of evergreens, which can leach a lot of nutrients from the soil and leave it acidic and sandy, and that's why crops don't grow there. But it is good for forestry because the forests are largely clear of a lot of underbrush or thorny things, meaning you can walk around and access them easier, which is why animals pick them as like grazing sites or something of that sort. So in the area there was a lot of hunting historically. Later on, that sort of land was also used for some light crop growth and potatoes, which can grow in pretty much any soil because they're a hardy plant. Now, the remainder of Poland, as shown in the green grasslands on this map, are the typical rich brown soil because it's been aerated by rivers and has high nutrient density because it's near rivers which carry in the nutrients. So the stable moisture and dense nutrients make up great plant growing soil, and this is where the vast majority of Poland's grain is grown. And that's why they became known as Poland's breadbasket. And even to this day, they're still used to grow the largest amount of wheat in this area. Additional crops that grow in the cooler climate are sugar beets and root vegetables such as, well, ordinary beets, carrots, and potatoes, and leeks as well. For things like, to spice their food, the Polish people often used herbs which they located in the forest and then planted around where they lived. This leads to the food choices that they make. As the forestry lended itself to having access to game, you have historical dishes such as sausages, hunter stew, pierogi, and which can have meat or some kind of vegetable or something inside them, depends. Pierogi are essentially all-purpose dumplings. So the sausages and hunter stew were made from the meat in the forests, and oftentimes when they'd have meat, they might have a bit of a sauce to the side, which was typically used the mushrooms and herbs from the same forest, along with cream from milk of the cows they kept. And on the side, they'd have things like pickling and root vegetables, which are the nice salty and sour taste will offset the taste of meat in a very nice way, make all the flavors come out well. So sauerkraut was a bit of a unique thing there. It's essentially shredded cabbage that's been boiled in some I think it was some kind of sauce, and no, wait, I'm sorry, I don't remember how they make sauerkraut, but I have had it before, and it's indeed sour, and it can be a bit of an acquired taste, but it is quite good. And sauerkraut has a high vitamin C content, which is why that it was kept for eating in the winter, so you wouldn't develop scurvy or other diseases. And in Europe, winters are very damp and cold, so that's again why there's a lot of warmer, hearty dishes. And in the modern era, there's little changes to the food there, the traditional food that is, because this is one of those cases where you can't improve upon perfection. But better planting and growth with better modern farming, such as use of chemical fertilizers, which was a process invented by Franz Haber in the nearby country of Germany to get more nitrogen in the soil. So they do that along with the use of modern equipment as naturally to farm, and much like everywhere else on Earth that's developed, they have a modern grocery, but people will still do forest foraging as tradition, but it's not a necessity by any means. And speaking of tradition, a lot of traditional foods are still made in restaurants or by people's families, where they're often seen as higher end restaurants or that you enjoy to go to on the weekends and perhaps meet up with some people there. So, within the past few decades, there's been an increase in the amount of traditional style bakeries, and in these bakeries, they make fresh baked goods such as like bread or pastries in the mornings, and people often go there before work. Despite the fact it is a stop, they do make breakfast there, like a egg sandwich, for example, which saves people a lot of time in the mornings, and you can't really beat that fresh warm bread. So overall, there's not been much of a change. Can't improve on perfection, but you can add foreign foods like Italian pizza or Chinese food or something of the like, because people do like a little bit of variety once it's available. The art of Poland is even more varied than the food they have there, as it spans from medieval religious art to our modern and contemporary movements. So the early works were focused exclusively on religion, with churches, frescoes, and things like manuscripts which were illuminated, meaning that they essentially turned each page into an art book around the edges, where letters would be in gold and paintings on the sides depicting what they thought was in the text. The Renaissance brought a bit of the humanist influence which expanded art to include things like portraits or paintings of historical events, with notable artists like Jan Matejko coming to prominence later. So this bringing of the human into art related to the rise of Romanticism, which influenced Poland by celebrating the national identity after Poland had been collapsed and divided after the end of their golden age in that Renaissance. So, and later on, after being recaptured again by Nazi Germany and the USSR and split between the two, they had trends like modernism, which had more avant-garde movements and Polish schools of posters. And during this time, socialist realism, or rather communist realism, dominated the art space briefly, because it was all about state-approved art, state unity and whatnot. And then this collapsed because the promises of the USSR had a clear failure, so people started to move toward more abstract and experimental art. So in a modern Poland, they try to bring back traditions for their national identity and still work on art today, which in the forms of modern art. So you'll see on screen the clown painting, or rather jester painting, was painted by Jan Matejko. Context is the jester hears something that the royal family will be ruined by, and he's not going to tell them just yet because he's supposed to be entertaining them at a party. This is actually a picture believed to be a jester who was a political advisor and satirist at the time. This painting of the war and the horses is covering the historical formation of Poland, and as you can see, two armies on each side. Very large painting painted by Mateo, I think, and it was stolen by the Nazis briefly hidden and then brought back. The reason why it was stolen was in an effort to destroy the Polish national identity, which has been attempted, as I've said a couple times, and failed every time. Another more human-scale piece of art is this tradition they have of painting the sides of houses with various nature-inspired things, such as these nice flowers. They say originally it started as a way to make the walls look a little less boring and then evolved into straight-up art. So as for the religions in Poland, that church picture didn't show up. That's a shame. So you have 72.43% Roman Catholic, which is kind of a given because Poland was formed on Catholicism with support of the Pope. 20% of modern Polish people have not declared their religion on this survey, or just might be deists or like skeptic or something of that sort. 6.9% of people outright say they're non-religious, with 2% remaining being other Christian denominations such as Lutheran, which has declined since the Middle Ages due to either moving to Germany or Catholicism or the effects of World War II. Now, 0.15% of Poland is non-Christian, which could be Islamic, Buddhist, Baptist, or Jewish. Formerly, roughly, I believe something akin to 15 to 20% of Polish population was Jewish, but they unfortunately died as a result of the Holocaust or were able to escape. And this demographic is still reflected in the data you see here. Another effect of World War II is that 20% undeclared and roughly 7% non-religious, which is actually quickly growing due to secularism. Now, language and dialect. Polish is the national language of Poland, with the vast majority of people who use it as their primary and first language. So 97.5% of Poles speak Polish as their first language, albeit linguistically uniform Polish with regional accents, which we'll get to later. 2% remaining speak Silesian, and the remainder of about 1% or so speak Ukrainian, German, and English in their everyday life due to the countries in the surrounding area or immigration. Although, do not mistake this for Poles only knowing one language. The vast majority of Poles are often educated in multiple languages, as is typical in Germany. Europe, due to the dozens of different languages spoken in Europe. So you have things like, so they will be able to speak either English or German as a second language, perhaps. Many of them, that is. So, as for speech and pronunciation, the Latin alphabet with a few additions is used because they were generally in the area affected by the Romans and the spread of Latin, which was used as the semi-universal language before English took that role in our modern era. So this significantly influenced their alphabet, but they do use the 9 added letters, which you can see for sounds not in English. Polish largely excludes X, Q, and V outside of loanwords from English. Pronunciation is typically fixed, which means that you have very few outlier words, with stress, usually falling on the second to last syllable, and dense consonant clusters contribute to the compact sound and the jokes you might hear about Polish people having names determined by throwing a keyboard. Although those jokes might annoy them. So for regional accents, you have things like Greater Polish, which is typically spoken in the west of Poland. It's influenced by German, so it's clipped, plain, and flatter, or in some people's opinions, harsher. Although Lesser Polish, which is spoken in southern Poland, has a more melodic, clear, and supposedly polite and educated sound. This is potentially influenced by either Italy, given the geography, or one of the other Slavic countries on the general proximity of Poland. Although that's just my conjecture. Now, another accent called Masovian, which was spoken in central Poland, is a bit sharper, hissier, and rural, and it's mostly faded in modernity because it, I assume, blended with Greater and Lesser Polish due to lack of differences. So, as for music and dance, they've had a long tradition of that. With it starting in hymns and progressing to a huge influence in the classical and Baroque era, and because folk influences retained the national identity of the country and generally spread its culture even under things like occupation or Reformation. So in the 13th century, the most music coming out of Poland was Latin hymns, as was typical for Europe, very religious back then. 15th century had more complex songs about religion. You'd hear things with a bit more complex composition then, and in the 16th century, in around the Polish Golden Age, you have a massive expansion of the music under the king's court, because it took folk music and European influences and mixed them and spread them around the general area. So with the area influencing Poland back, you get things like opera and orchestral works, but Poland also retains its folk melodies, which begin to enter those orchestral compositions. And continuing from the music under the king's court, you have things like courtly dances or general formal dance, and then other traditions improve. Other traditions continue. And with the rise of Romanticism and the nationalism movement of Poland, you have things like piano works, mazurkas polonaises, which are symphonies, and one of the great topics of the time were that many of them emphasized Polish identity, which resulted in their national dances being more popular globally. So one of the artists responsible for this was Frederick Chopin, who is a famous musician even outside of Poland. I believe in grade school we're often shown his piano pieces, or that might have just been me. So in the early 20th century and the modernism era, you get the reaction to the communism and the war, which is, well, World War One. You have things like the avant-garde movement spreading, and more experimentation, and they're trying to get their identity back. So you get ballet and folk dances returning, and then after World War II, the culture itself was a bit damaged by the Soviet mandates. So you get people trying to bring that back with revival of folk music, choir, bringing and even bringing American jazz to Poland. And you still have things like the communist themed compositions based on like the USSR as a state and such, but various dance people gained prominence. And in the late 20th to early 21st century, you get things like our modern rock, pop, hip-hop spreading in there, because the global styles will blend, and the Polish people try to blend their tradition with this too. So you get things like contemporary or fusion music. But a lot of music that does come out of there is typically things like electronic music, or even things like post-rock, which is found in a lot of Soviet areas, which is something that I actually like. So you can't have a country without politics. So the current governmental structure of Poland involves a constitutional parliamentary republic with a bicameral legislature, which means that the executive branch is split into two. And they have a parliament. So the president is their head of the state, and the prime minister is the head of the government's operations, where essentially the serve as a diplomat, whereas the other tends to state matters. So instead of a House and Senate like they have something a bit similar, but also with some differences. So the Sejm, the lower house, controls the budgets, passes the laws, and in the case of a massive government issue, they can dissolve the government by voting a no confidence vote as a check and balance. So the Senate, or the upper house, revises the laws and advises the Sejm by reviewing legislation and suggesting changes before passing it, kind of like our Senate, but it has 100 seats here. So, and I've included a picture of the Sejm. So the president is Karol Nawrocki, and the prime minister is Donald Tusk. So Karol Nawrocki focuses more on the national identity of Poland, whereas Donald Tusk is one of the more typical EU-friendly guys. So the Senate has the KO, or Coalition Obywatelska, which has 43 seats. They're a centrist liberal. They also have 156 seats in the Sejm. So you have the slim majority being centrist liberal democratic type. Senate, again, you have the Third Way Party, which is 12 seats, a Christian Democratic group, and the left has 8 seats in the Senate. And as for their opposition parties, you have the NP, or rather New Poland, centrist, and the PIS, Law and Justice, which are nationalist conservatives, and they have 34 seats in the Senate. And onto the Sejm, we have the PSL, Polskie Stronnictwo Ludowe, and they have 32 seats. They kind of your farmer small government party. They focus on pragmatism and kind of dinner table issues. Poliska 2050 has 32 seats. They're Reformist Liberal Green Party. Luika, Social Democrats who focus on the EU and civil rights. They have 21 seats. Opposition parties are Prawak, the PIS again, who have 190 seats, reflecting some conservative and more nationalistic parts of the Polish people. And the Konfederika, who have 18 seats, are a far right group with more libertarian economic policies. Smaller miscellaneous groups have the remaining seats. And as for folklore, there are various types of Polish folklore, this is something I just researched today. So a lot of their folklore from the area originates from local myths, Slavic pagan beliefs, which are generally as expected in the area, and some of the Middle Ages Christian beliefs that influence our and Europe's thinking and their various country traditions. So pre-Christian religion included things like forest and water spirits, because that's animism, which is often one of the religions that people construct. And they had a tradition of ancestor worship, which after the introduction of Christianity turned into a respectful attitude for ancestors. And back to the Slavic myths, you have things like Baba Yaga and all that. So, but again, much of the initial religion is the animistic stuff, which says that a forest or a river have spirits which embody fears of getting lost, drowned, or catching disease or something. Kind of like weed. Kind of like people used to believe in things in the forest that would drag people off and eat them. Which is really just boars, but which are actually popular which are actually common in the woodlands of this area, especially cool woodlands. They're ferocious creatures. So, another fear local to the area, or the broader Slavic area, is the fear of the restless dead. So the Polish people initially believed in things like having to check graves and light candles and place offerings there. Same reason behind ancestor worship initially, which is another common thing. And a lot of their myths boil down to needing to understand the rules of the world and why it works, which could have potentially influenced their later desires for higher education standards in the country, which began even along Poland's founding in the year 1000. So other things are seasonal magic, which is typical pagan belief, holiday and seasonal things, and Christian influence starting in the about 900s to 1000 caused pagan religion to adapt into traditions. So the Christian tradition of blessing food might originate here, or be mixed from the Last Supper story. So either way, this adapts and blends with the local traditions, and things like All Saints Day, which has a local tradition of visiting graves and vigils and candles instead of the All Hallows Eve tradition, which was found in Ireland. So the tradition of Easter eggs actually originally came from this area. They were supposed to represent the rebirth of spring, or the transitional period of the time. So they would paint the eggs, but I'm afraid I'd didn't do enough research to know quite why, but it has been adapted into a tradition which we do not often ask the origins of worldwide. So, their general cultural attitude due to their religion is more cautious because they believed in things like older pagan figures who can be outwitted or may catch you if you're arrogant. So they value being wise more than rewarding heroic virtue or fighting sin, kind of like with our myths of devils or whatnot. And on to something a little less serious, we have sports. So as with much of the entire world, soccer is their number one thing. They often have like clubs and a variety of things where people watch it, kind of like American football. Except they have fields and such for their clubs, or you might actually join a football club. So volleyball, which is a surprising sport, which they have there, it's a spectator sport, and the men's national team actually has been top ranked globally several times. But to something more expected, ski jumping, they're huge on, and they've made it to the Olympics several times because of it's generally a snowy area, being in the more upper parts of Europe and having more snowfall. And then for something involving a bit more speed but less jumping, you have motorcycle speedway, which often draws big crowds, and it's one of the nation's favorite motorsports. Think similar to how we have NASCAR. Other stuff, they have baseball, handball, and even a little bit of esports, which is slowly growing. So that's a thing we have. And thank you for watching.